Like, I mean, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Every side there is. And that's all we got.
And I like when it's like the pictures project, you can see the snow.
Yeah. So we're, I don't think it's in there. But it's looking on there, I scrolled down.
I know.
Yeah. That's
Too much of this.
It is.
That's what I'm saying.
It was the beginning of the. Yeah. Yeah. Hello, everybody.
Hello, everybody. Is that better? Hold it in closer. Okay. I can hear it now. Hello, everybody, for the third or fourth time. We're doing great here. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We are here for the annual Webb lecture. For those of you who know the school, you know that Raymond Webb was one of our alums. He was very influential in the mental health world and the world of intellectual disabilities here in Western Pennsylvania. And he founded actually the first community mental health center here in the Pittsburgh area, and also founded the Pennsylvania Community Providers Association, and did a whole bunch of other really wonderful stuff during his life. Upon his death, some of his friends and colleagues came together to endow this fellowship, which we use both for this lecture, which we do annually, and also for some scholarships for students. And so it provides a wonderful opportunity for us to continue his focus on public welfare and the importance of the public system in addressing the needs of our community. And so I am very excited to welcome two of our alums back today. I'm not actually doing the welcome, so I'm not allowed to say very much more about them. But I'm very excited about the topic that we're talking about too. For those of you who know me, many of you know me only as the dean of this school, in which case I do a variety of things. But if you knew me before I was the dean of this school, you would realize that my area is actually children's mental health, with a real focus on kids who are served across multiple sectors and whose pathways through and around the system and their families' involvement and all of the complexity. So the idea of dual involved is a portion of what I was interested in, and juvenile justice and child welfare are such huge parts of the system that our society has in place to try to address the needs of kids and families who are experiencing a whole range of challenges. And it's particularly wonderful to be in this room today. I don't know about the rest of you, but at the moment I need to be in spaces with people who are trying to do good things in complicated worlds, who are remembering why we're here and that other people actually matter, and that our job is to be here to make a difference and to try to make the world a better place. So thank you all for coming today. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sarah Goodkind, who was instrumental in inviting our speakers today and is going to introduce them. So Sarah.
Hi, everyone. I'm so delighted to have the opportunity to introduce two of our alums from the School of Social Work who we'll be learning from today. One of them, Karen, I've known for a long time, having had the honor of working with her and serving as a member of her dissertation committee. And the other, Macon, I just met this past year, which was also an honor. Both are amazing leaders in our field who we're so proud to see doing the work to make our systems better for the young people who are involved with them. So I'll start by introducing Macon. Macon Stewart is a senior fellow and deputy director of the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform in the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University, where she's worked for the past 17 years, I believe. She's recognized as a leading expert on systemic reform to address the needs of youth involved with multiple human service and legal systems. Macon is one of the architects of the crossover youth practice model, which we'll be learning about today. And she's managed its implementation in over 120 communities across the country. She's published widely on this work and serves on numerous commissions, boards, and councils related to education and racial justice, thus extending her impact well beyond the child welfare and juvenile justice systems. Kolivoski is a research professor and deputy director for research at the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at Georgetown, the same center, their colleague, as well as a research fellow of juvenile justice in the Youth Development Department at Child Trends. She's been involved in data and evaluation efforts for the crossover youth practice model for the past 10 years, contributing to research that helps jurisdictions better serve youth involved in both the child welfare and juvenile justice systems. Like Macon, Karen has published extensively in this area, and she has testified before Congress on juvenile justice and child welfare, demonstrating her commitment to using research to drive meaningful change. There's lots more I could say about both of these amazing women, but I think our time together is better used for you to hear directly from them. As someone who myself, like Betsy, does work in this area, I'm thrilled to have these leaders in the field here to share their knowledge and experience. And we had a great session with them this morning with the doctoral students. Interestingly, though their work is leading policy and practice change in the child welfare and juvenile justice systems, I've learned that both Macon and Karen were in the direct practice MSW concentration when they were at Pitt, which I think goes to show how important it is that we think comprehensively and critically across systems, modes of practice, and substantive areas in the work that we do. So to learn more about how they do this, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Macon and Karen. So just for you all to know, we've recently redone the technology in this room. And there are microphones all around the room that can be helpful when you're recording to capture questions. But it also means that if you all are chattering amongst yourselves during this talk, it'll be captured on the recording that we're making of this session. So keep that in mind. And
So you know what that means? It means be nice in your sidebar conversations. Good afternoon to you all. I'm excited to be here. I graduated some time ago from the university, actually in 2002. And this is only my second time coming back. I came back in 2004 because a friend of mine graduated. So very excited and honored to be back to talk about the work that Karen and I do at the center and across the country. So a little bit about who we are at the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform and the things that we do. I'm not going to go into depth about the information that's on this slide. You can find it on our website, cjjr.georgetown.edu. I would say for me, we have a lot of certificate programs where agency leaders come on campus. They're trained for a period of time on different topics. We have leadership networks where we bring leaders together from across the country just in a open space where they can just kind of let their hair down and talk about the challenges that they are facing. A lot of national initiatives. We do work in communities across the country on a number of different topics. But the statement here, national footprint focused on local reform efforts, is the aim that we have. Our desire is to really impact what's happening in communities across the country and take a lot of data and research and actual practical experience and work with folks to make change. And some of what you'll hear Karen and I talking about today gets into the realm of when folks are doing direct service and working on the line, they aren't necessarily cognizant of the things that folks in this room as researchers know. They're not thinking about that when they're making those decisions. And so our job is to help bring that kind of theoretical thinking and understanding to the forefront of their minds so that it can help impact the day-to-day decisions. So this is who we are. This is what we do. We're housed in the McCourt School of Public Policy. And we do training in TA with communities across the country. We do some research. Karen will talk some about that because that is the part of our shop that she maintains. But we're looking to make reform at the local level. So I'm going to shift us into why you're here today to hear about us and why this population is so important. So we have fluctuated between the term of crossover youth, which is the term that we started using when we developed the model. Crossover youth, which is that intersection of child welfare and juvenile justice. One of the things we realized is that when we were trying to think of what to call it or the thing, we're like, this is what happens, but this is not who these young people are. It's a phenomenon of an experience that occurs with them, but it's not who they are. And so we've been shifting to use a term, and Karen will get into this, that's more focused on the systems part of it, because that is what leads them to be a part of this population. And let me just say why this is important. We go to a lot of communities and we hear folks say all the time, well, we don't have a lot of these kids, or we don't know what to do with them, or we don't necessarily want to touch them. But this is why it's important. Number one, it's going to happen. Whether a community decides to do anything about this population of young people or not, they are going to cross over from one system or another. Also, the other thing is that this phenomenon happens not because of what a young person does. It's because of things that have happened to them and continued vulnerabilities and risks that they face because they are in custodial systems. And that is the reality. We're going to unpack that a bit, but that's why it's important. It's going to happen. And the long-term outcomes for this population of young people is dire. And so if we think about what we know happens to young people who are in child welfare, are the outcomes good? They're not. Kids who are involved in juvenile justice, outcomes good? They're not. They are further exacerbated for this population of young people. And so while there are assumptions in the field that, okay, if I get this second system involved, we're going to have access to more resources, access to more services. You're not, for the most part, but what you're also going to have is that you're going to make the experience of this young person and their family far worse than if they were in the one system. And so that's why this population is very important. So we're going to unpack a lot of this in a little bit of time that we have. And it's funny, as I was thinking about what I was going to say and we were putting together slides, I kept thinking each of these things could be like a full day lecture, but we only have 30 minutes. And so we're going to give you our 30 minutes and then we're going to get on out the way. So Karen, I'm going to turn it over to you and she's going to get into definitions.
Thank you, everyone. It's so exciting to be here. So Macon had mentioned too, but not being back from Pitt. So I have not returned to Pitt since the summer of 2012 when I was finishing my dissertation, learned I needed to get the signatures of my committee members and drove around Pittsburgh that day to get the signatures from my committee members so that Friday I could turn it in, and then woke up on Saturday and drove to Baltimore for my postdoc to start it on Monday. So I have not been back since 2012. So I'm MSW from 2006 and PhD from 2012. So thank you all for letting us talk to you all today. So I get to give you the portion of definitions. So we talked a little bit about it, and we don't want to get too bogged down kind of in the terminology, but I do think it's important, especially if you're not familiar kind of when we use terms like crossover youth, dual system youth, kind of what we're talking about. So very broadly, the term crossover youth is referring to young people who have experienced maltreatment, so that's abuse or neglect, and then engage in delinquent behaviors. The thing with crossover youth, it's a very umbrella term, so we're not referring to system involvement here because, as we know, behaviors might not come to the attention of these formal systems. And so for us, we want to sometimes use terminology that's going to be broad enough to capture even if young people aren't coming to the attention of kind of these formal systems. So that's kind of the umbrella term. You'll hear us talk about crossover youth practice model. So to know a little bit more about that. From under the umbrella term of crossover youth, then comes the offshoot of dual system youth. And so again, to speak a little bit more to what Macon was talking about with terminology, here we're referring to some level of systems involvement in the child welfare and the juvenile justice system. And again, trying to get around the framing more about kind of the role of systems, and systems need to make the change rather than the young people themselves. Within kind of umbrella crossover youth, then we get into dual system youth. Under that, and again, not to get too bogged down in the terms, but just so you all know, kind of the further categorization of kind of how we talk about this group of young people based on the timing and the nature of their child welfare and juvenile justice system involvement. So, and often these terms vary very much based on what geography and jurisdiction we're working with. But dual contact youth is referring to young people who have non-concurrent involvement with systems. So what this typically looks like is a young person, an adolescent is arrested or gets involved in the juvenile justice system and has a historical involvement with the child welfare system. So when they were a child, they were investigated for maltreatment. There was something kind of in their past, but nothing at the moment in terms of a current kind of involvement in child welfare. So that's dual contact. The other category is duly involved youth. So this is a smaller portion of youth who are having that concurrent touch point in both the child welfare and the juvenile justice systems. And then kind of the category under that refers to duly adjudicated youth. So they're getting a little bit more formally involved in these systems. So they're both involved in child welfare and juvenile justice at the same time and have received a formal adjudication under those. So let me tell you a little bit more about kind of this population as a whole. So who experiences crossover? What do we know about the population? In terms of numbers and scope, 2/3 of youth with juvenile justice petitions have had some form of child welfare system contact. Doing research in this area for long enough, I can talk all about, and again, all of these things can be separate topics. We still don't have national numbers for this population. That is a goal of the research that I'm happy to talk about. But I think the point here is that for a long time in the research, crossover youth, dual system youth were kind of thought of as a special topic population or kind of a boutique population over here, but wasn't pervasive throughout kind of these systems involved youth. So now we kind of know that 2 out of every 3 young person in juvenile justice has had some form of child welfare system contact, which I think really, as us as social workers, should just have us be aware of the role of prevention and early intervention. And for me, a lot of the focus is what can we do about their involvement when they're in the child welfare system that's going to prevent then that involvement into juvenile justice. So happy to talk about that more about why we don't yet have national numbers, but just to kind of say that this is quite, I think, a much broader kind of touch of youth than we originally kind of thought. In terms of pathways, everyone always kind of wants to know, so if you're duly involved, kind of how are young people becoming involved in both systems? And for the vast majority of young people, I think our figure is 92% of young people move from the child welfare system first into the juvenile justice system. And so this can, I think I mentioned before, kind of have that history of involvement in child welfare, and then kind of as a young person becomes a teenager and gets a referral or picks up an arrest, then becomes involved in the juvenile justice system. So most young people are moving child welfare to juvenile justice, but I think it's important to also recognize that that's not the only pathway, that there are still youth who move from juvenile justice to the child welfare system. And so 2 examples, so folks kind of aren't kind of in depth into kind of the knowledge of these systems, kind of 2 ways that that typically works is that one is that upon a youth like getting arrested or coming into the juvenile justice system, it's then discovered at intake or assessment that there is uncovered or unrecognized maltreatment or abuse, and therefore there needs to be, something active is happening and there needs to be an open case referral to child welfare. The other population is that when young people are exiting the juvenile justice system, so they kind of have done their time in the juvenile justice system, there's planning for a case closure, and it gets revealed that that young person either doesn't have a stable placement to go home to, or the parents or the guardians don't want them back at home, which I think is a whole other, unfortunate situation to discuss. Then there's a referral made to child welfare. And so that's another population to be mindful of. As Macon hinted, we're just balls of good news and good light. So unfortunately, right now, the outcomes are still pretty dire for young people who experience crossover. And to the dean's point too, we house a lot of our discussions in child welfare and juvenile justice conversations, but that's not the only touch point that young people unfortunately have with these multiple systems. And so worse outcomes in terms of mental health, substance use, worse outcomes in terms of employment and education. Also, there's that connection, again, a whole other topic about the connections between the child welfare, the juvenile justice system, and then criminal justice system involvement as well. The other thing I always think is just interesting that I've learned in this research is that crossover youth tend to get arrested at younger ages than youth who don't have that dual system involvement. So again, I think for me, it always points a lot to kind of the need for that early involvement, early intervention, thinking about front end things we can do so that we don't have these back end outcomes. So then who experiences crossover? Everyone always wants to kind of know about the demographics and the different characteristics. So hopefully it helps provide some information. And it's of no surprise that these are young people who have family histories of trauma, there's instability, there's socioeconomic disadvantage. Again, because these could all be separate topics in and of themselves. When it comes to gender, I think it's interesting because we often think of the juvenile justice system and we think about delinquency as a boys issue. But what we know among the crossover population is that there's a substantial proportion of girls. And so again, more and more attention being made to girls, but that historically hasn't kind of always been the case. In terms of race and ethnicity, and again, I think for folks who work in these systems, these are not surprising. We know that there's overrepresentation of youth of color in the child welfare system. We know that there's unfortunately overrepresentation of youth of color in the juvenile legal system. And when it comes to crossover, that just is exacerbated as well. And young people are overrepresented. And I think it's also important, again, these are all topics we can have whole conversations about, but when it comes to race, to talk about that these are systems that have historically excluded Black youth, youth of color from these systems, and now youth are overrepresented. And so again, happy to kind of have those conversations. The other portion is youth who identify as LGBTQ+, and of course, a lot of what we do or what I do is administrative data, so that can be hard to come by, but what we do know from conservative estimates is that among crossover youth, that number is about 20%. And again, we can get into the research about that's a hard thing sometimes to measure and kind of what does that mean. But all of that, I think, to say to really point to the intersectionality and the overlap of these different identities, these different characteristics, to really more and more pay attention to kind of the role that especially race, racism, and sexism kind of play for these different experiences. And so a special kind of topic within the broader crossover youth population that has been of interest for us and that we've been working on is focused specifically on Black girls who experience crossover, because we know that they are, again, unfortunately at this a special disadvantage in terms of the nexus of racism and sexism. So being kind of the result of, racial bias, gendered perceptions of what is appropriate behavior, systemic biases. So, and that's just one example. There's so many kind of pieces in which these different characteristics and identities really intersect to play a role. In terms of their experiences that place youth at risk of crossover, so a lot of the work that I'm interested in and the research that I've kind of really wanted to focus on is the role of the child welfare system itself as kind of that kind of pathway into the juvenile justice system. And for us, we like to think then and hope that the child welfare system is helping youth. And I think for us, it's important to have that critical understanding of the ways in which kind of involvement in the child welfare system is this catalyst into the juvenile justice system. And so the longer that a young person is spending in the child welfare system, the greater likelihood they're having of experiencing instability and then being involved in the juvenile justice system. The other factor that really plays a role is placement in congregate care settings. So when young people are placed outside the home and they're removed from their family of origin, they're not with kin, they're in settings in which there are staff members who are trained and paid to be there, it's a very different environment than when you're in a family-like setting. So now you're removing a young person from the stable and supportive relationships that they have. And in facilities, oftentimes, staff are trained to call the police when something happens, as opposed to when you would be in your home of origin or with, family that would be hopefully less likely or less likely to probably call the police if there is an issue. The other factor is frequent placement changes in the child welfare system. So again, these are things that are disrupting a young person's sense of stability and supportive environment that really then kind of are that catalyst for engaging in risky behaviors that are going to come to the attention of systems. And related to that, I wanted to mention kind of the interplay of these factors. So we know that amongst out-of-home placement youth, 40% of Black youth, 40% of Indigenous youth are undergoing 3 or more placement changes a year. And so just thinking about kind of the role that these placement changes are having in disrupting stability and connections to supports and relationships that matter, that then that frequent placement change is then making this catalyst, like just kind of the interplay of all these factors. So moving a lot, being placed in these deeper end facilities like congregate care really play a role. And if more Black youth, Indigenous youth are being placed there in the first place, they're already at this heightened involvement. But there's other factors as well. And again, I'm sure you all have your expertise in areas as well and can see the intersection of things like commercial exploitation of children. So when young people are engaging in behaviors that are criminalized rather than seen as, you know, outcries for being supportive or for help, that kind of is, you know, we're not protecting young people, we're criminalizing them. For unhoused youth, they're more likely to engage in risky behaviors that are going to come to the attention of these systems. And again, exclusionary school discipline or school practices. So when you're removing young people from, again, school academic settings, extracurricular activities that are supportive for them and placing them in places that are unfamiliar, you're really at that heightened risk of juvenile justice system involvement. And the last thing I want to say before I turn it back to Macon is that for folks who aren't kind of in the juvenile justice space, ideally, we don't want young people to go deeper into the juvenile justice system. So the research really supports that these front end kind of touch points for the juvenile justice system are actually more helpful. So restorative justice practices, diversion practices are actually more beneficial for young people's outcomes. But that when we look at the decision points for young people to get further into the juvenile justice system, there's actually an overrepresentation of crossover youth the deeper they get into the juvenile justice system. So I think that's just important. And Macon, I think I'm turning it to you to tell us more about the challenges that they face.
So I'm going to speak just a little bit about what some of the challenges are that these young people face, but it's not relative to them. It's about the systems that they are a part of that are supposed to be serving them. Number one, the fact that these systems traditionally work in silos, and if leaders are not intentional, those silos continue, and that is how their services are provided. So if we think about a young person who, let's say, is involved in child welfare, that system focuses on permanency, safety, and well-being. And generally speaking, and I former child welfare worker for many years in the District of Columbia, we weren't cognizant or thinking about what happens in a juvenile justice system, or what happens with Department of Mental Health, or, you know, education to some degree, but not really. We were focused on what do I do as a child welfare worker to support this young person family. So therefore, if a young person becomes involved in an additional system, I oftentimes wasn't sure what that meant for me, or what does that also mean for the experience that they are going to have. But the lack of knowledge about other systems and the fact that we function in silos puts families at disadvantages when they have to be involved with the second system. But what it also does is I'm not necessarily cognizant of the things that I am doing that may exacerbate their involvement in a second system of care. So I may be doing more harm, although not intentionally. But right now, there's a lot of these systems do function as silos, and it does not benefit the young people and families that they serve. There's also a lack of coordination between those systems. It's always very interesting to me that generally child welfare and juvenile justice are using the same providers to provide the same types of services, but for different reasons, and are expecting a different outcome. And so when you have a family that's involved with multiple systems, a lot of times these families may be getting some of the very similar services or have different case plans that are not coordinated because folks are functioning in silos and don't understand what's happening in their other cases. Karen talked about the overrepresentation of marginalized groups. That goes without saying. All those things are further exacerbated for Black and Brown families. Whenever they come into these systems, they stay in longer, more harm is done, and how they are seen is just very different. And I know that as a practicing social worker, it used to be very clear to me when I didn't work in CPS. I worked in ongoing after the investigation had been done, and it was decided we were going to keep the case. There were very clear differences in how colleagues saw a abuse or neglect case that came from a family who may have lived in upper Northwest DC than a family who lived in Southeast. Very different, very different. That continues throughout. I mean, how folks are seen is very different. How they are treated is very different. So that leads to our overrepresentation. Karen talked about the long-term outcomes. They're just not good. In the spirit of trying to do well, we aren't. we are further harming families. And that leads to the need for us to be more preventative and think about upfront practices and being more focused on what we do at the community level to keep kids in community and to better service families. And there's also one thing I will raise too, is the fact that in juvenile justice, historically, young people are not viewed as a part of a family system. Young people, they serve the child. They don't serve the child within the context of the family versus child welfare, which looks at the family as a whole. But you cannot do that. A young person is a part of a family system. And if we're only serving the child, then we're completely missing the mark. So that's a huge variance in those two systems that, some of the work helps to mitigate. So next, I'm just going to talk about how these systems respond or how they fail to respond, so to speak. So what we know is that the systems are fragmented, very fragmented. A lot of the responses that they give are ineffective. There are a lot of gaps around interagency collaboration. Typically, if I'm a child welfare social worker, I don't understand the juvenile justice system or what that means. I can tell you of the 120 plus communities that we've worked in, probably about 95% of the staff that we've worked with said, I have no clue what my counterpart in the other system does. So I don't know what to anticipate when a young person becomes involved in that other system. They generally don't understand what assessment tools are used, what those assessment tools lead to, how that impacts case planning, and what that means for services. But that also flows into, if we think about education, all of these young people should be going to school, and education is a huge component of how we anticipate folks will, the trajectory that they will take in life to lead to a better life. These young people generally are not functioning well in school, may have multiple absences, a lot of absences, and are not being adequately serviced within the school setting. And so therefore, that's another gap. A lot of them, I don't know if either of us are going to talk about the educational outcomes for this population. Karen alluded to them a little bit, but they're not good. And so while we talk about child welfare and JJ, there's also the education piece that absolutely needs to be addressed for this population of young people, educating educators on how to better serve them within the school setting. What is the role of a school social worker or a counselor to providing some stability for this population of young people? But there's also Department of Mental Health. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we do in the crossover youth practice model. But one thing that's clear is that even if child welfare and juvenile justice are aligned, they are communicating and they are doing well, this young person still has to receive services. And those services have to be effective. They have to be services that are geared towards that population, or everybody talking isn't going to change much. It's going to change the systemic side of it, but it's not going to change the outcomes for this population of young people. So now I'm going to get into the work that we do with the crossover youth practice model. So this is a model that looks at that intersection of child welfare and juvenile justice. The principles of the practice model, as you can see in our nice little graphic here, it focuses on collaboration, ensuring that folks who are a part of custodial systems understand who the other is and what that means when they're involved in the life of a young person and a family. And for me, I always say the crossover youth practice model, it's not rocket science, it's just good social work. And it's good social work that is not allowed to happen because of how these systems are orchestrated, or because folks just have really high caseloads. And if I have a really high caseload, then all of the things I would like to do, I'm not going to be able to do because I just don't have the time. There are not enough hours in the day for me to do all the things for these young people. But also the reality is, as a child welfare social worker, there are things that you are responsible for, knowing and understanding, that really just aren't humanly possible for you to be able to do because you're not the direct caregiver or this young person. So there's the need to have strong collaboration between the systems that are serving these young people. There's also an element of this work that focuses on prevention, because honestly, young people not being in these systems is what works best. What works best for them in present, but also in future. What this model also does is it helps to ensure the voice of young people and family members are a part of the case plans, and also are a part of the systemic change that we're seeking to make. Not generally, all the time, families are powerless and their voice is not considered And even when folks say it is considered, it's minorly considered. But this process helps to ensure that they are part of the development of it, but also that in their case planning, in their court hearings, that their voice is very prevalent and that there's power, that they are able to speak truth to power in their services. Also, it helps to ensure equity. What we see a lot of is that there is not equity, not just for marginalized populations, but also when a young person who is in child welfare crosses over into the juvenile justice system, the standard of practice and service varies because there are a lot of assumptions that are made because that young person is involved in child welfare. And there are a lot of things that they are not the recipient of where they should be. And so this helps to ensure that there's equity across the board. Also, data. Data is a huge component of it. Karen talked a little bit about data. We're not going to get into the mires of data, but we try to work with communities to ensure that they're making decisions based on sound data and not just anecdotes. Karen spoke to the fact that there are not national numbers on this population. And when we go and work with communities, usually they have no clue how many kids they have. They are just randomly guessing based on how many kids somebody may have on their caseload. The judge may say, well, I think I've seen X number of these kids in my courtroom. But because these computer systems don't talk in child welfare and juvenile justice, and a lot of times when we're working with communities, they are literally using Excel spreadsheets that they are plopping numbers into, and then they're trying to merge the data. And a lot of them don't even have data folks. Or sometimes we're able to use court files and they could say, okay, well, because there are X number of dependency cases, X number of delinquency cases, then we're going to merge the court files and see who has a court file in common. But then that also excludes a lot of young people who never have an open court case, but they are still yet touching these systems. So part of the work we aim to do with communities too is to ensure that there are data practices and that they are able to use data to identify the population and to better understand what the experiences are from a data perspective, and then are therefore using the data to drive their response in their work. Let's see. Okay, so we're going to shift into how do we improve outcomes for these young people that are at the crossroads. I think we're doing this together, Karen. Okay, so now we're going to kind of shift into what are some of the options relative to what you may decide to do in working in either of these systems to support young people. So from a child welfare perspective, there's always a need for folks who understand and are empathetic to become child welfare social workers. And I mean, for me, that is not where I wanted to start. I started doing that because I needed a job when I was leaving here, and that's who was hiring. But I would not be where I am today relative to the experience I had I not had that direct practice experience. I can say that without reservation. Being a child welfare social worker, it helps you understand families, communities, but it also helps you understand how these systems work and what the need for change is. And it also helped me take what was a lot of like theoretical information that I learned being in graduate school and learn how to apply that when I'm sitting in front of a family and a young person. But of course, in child welfare, there are different types of jobs that you can pursue. You know, there's just being a frontline caseworker, there's policy, there's planning, there's data, there's quality assurance. So for folks who are direct practice, to me, that's a direct obvious. For folks who are not direct practice, it still can be one because they still need folks who understand how to take data and use it to impact change in practice, direct practice. So for me, the work we do at the center, it's like it's the best of both worlds. It's the experience of what happens on the front line and utilization of data and merging it so that you're not just doing data for the sake of data. We have that conversation all the time. It's like having data that sits on the shelf is not helpful, but being able to use data to impact what experiences young people and family have is very important. Next is the youth legal system. That is a term that we are starting to use as opposed to saying juvenile justice because there is no justice in the juvenile system. And so we're going to call it what it is. It is a legal system. But there's a continued need for folks, whether it's working direct services, being a probation officer, being a parole officer, working with young people and families. Again, pretty much very similar to what you'll do in child welfare. It's just from the youth legal perspective. There's also behavioral health systems. The fact that we need good, solid service providers. One of the challenges we commonly see in communities that we work in is that the quality of behavioral health services that are provided to young people and families, there is no quality. It's trash. It is trash. And we want parents to, and young people to do better, be better, but we are providing them shitty services, and I'm putting it mildly. And so there's always the need for folks who understand this and have patience and empathy to be good service providers to these young people and families. And there is, I mean, the challenges are immense. They really are. But there's a huge need there. So Karen, I'm gonna turn it over to you to speak a little bit about research. Okay.
And I won't get too heavy into research, and we'll be wrapping up our talk soon, but I did want to mention a little bit, kind of thinking about the research on a very macro level, and then a couple things kind of on the more on the ground level. So I mentioned before the need for more national estimates. We are currently working with folks leading a study in Cal State, out of Cal State LA, that hopefully will get to that national numbers goal. So as Macon kind of hinted at, there's a lot of reasons why we don't have them, mostly related to data access, fragmented data systems. These child welfare, juvenile justice systems operate kind of on different levels based on geography. There's kind of a whole piece there to talk about. The other piece in terms of research that I think is important to mention is we often talk a lot, especially at least now I see a lot of this trend for including youth voice, and just having us be mindful of how we are using youth voice, and are we coming at it with an equitable approach. We talk a lot about, you know, the need to compensate young people, compensate them fairly. When we pay them, are they aware of kind of the tax implications? Just all of the things we want to be mindful of, rather than just tokenizing and saying, oh, we want to include youth voice and equity. Kind of what does that actually look like? So I see the real need for that in the research. And then the last piece on a very kind of broad research level is really looking at more action-oriented strategies. And so whether that's the CYPM or something else, I think there's a lot of research that I do think is helpful for us to know more about the population, but I would like to see more about what works for the population. What do we do about them? Like descriptive studies are nice, but what are we doing? And so for me, coming at this from originally doing more administrative data, kind of studying the population, that was part of the appeal of wanting to learn more about the cross youth practice model, because I feel like, okay, that is something. It's not perfect and we always need to work on it. And so whether that's the CYPM or not, you know, just happy to do that, because especially now that I'm at CJJR, I'm just very mindful of, I'm now evaluating a program that I work for. So always happy to have external partners and evaluators, you know, to make sure that we're being transparent on how we are evaluating our program. On a more kind of micro or direct practice level, for folks who are interested in this work, and Macon mentioned a little bit about it with the data, I think it's important to kind of not be afraid of taking on that data identity and building a data culture in your organization or your agency. So data is not something that that person does over there, but rather making sure that we are having data lead the conversations, not just these anecdotes of practice, being mindful of what data is collected. Data is not in and of itself the holy grail that we should all be paying attention to. We should be critically thinking about what data we're collecting, how, and what we're missing. But I do think for folks who are working directly in these systems, just being mindful of data is not something done over there, but how do we build it into the culture? And part of the reason, so I think sometimes folks are like, okay, well, what do I do? How do I get that started? And for me, I'm always interested in what are your data sharing agreements? I think a lot of times there are these silos because folks are so afraid to kind of engage in information sharing. But if you actually look at, you know, there might be an MOU, there might already be a memorandum of understanding in place for that data can be shared, or certain amounts of data can be shared, or kind of what can we use with the data. So that's kind of the piece I wanted to talk about. The other thing I'll talk about, and I know we need to be wrapping up, is the advocacy piece. And this covers a lot in terms of legislation, in terms of policy implications, but I think at the end of the day, and again, to echo what Macon said, I think the importance of humanizing youth. So especially the more and more that, you know, Macon and I get involved in these systems and these people, like we're not always, I want to always be mindful of how we are talking about populations that we're working for. These are kids just like our kids, just like your kids. Like these are kids that just want to be connected to extracurricular activities, that just want to, you know, thrive. And so just being mindful of the human aspect of it. And the other piece in terms of advocacy is really focusing on systems as the locus of change. And so even kind of in our conversations of like, let's describe the population, I don't want the change to be on that youth. I don't want to build another resilient youth. I want to build systems. I want to build structures that are in place so that the youth doesn't have to be superhumanly resilient. And Macon, you always say too, systems are people. And so we often use this language of systems like it's the thing over here that's doing the bad things. But we need to be mindful of the role that we are each placing kind of in these systems and doing these bad things, or at least kind of having that acknowledgement. And then the last piece with advocacy, I think to mention is just the importance of relationships. So again, if you're a person kind of in the field more directly, I think it can be overwhelming to think about how do I do this work? And oftentimes it's just having great relationships with other partners. Not everyone might be willing to work with you or to work across these systems, but I'll know Macon. Macon's over at that agency and I can talk to her, and that just the importance of those relationships can really help kind of be the building block for broader change, for changing practices, for changing protocols. Macon, I think you're going to talk about administration, and then we're going to wrap up.
So the last option is administration. This is just folks who do things like Karen and I do, folks who work in nonprofits, lead nonprofit organizations, or folks who work within the federal government, if such shall be an option soon to come, who knows, who understand what the needs are for at-risk and vulnerable populations. We need folks who have a history of having worked in systems, but are empathetic to what humans are dealing with and are leading agencies with that vantage point, understanding that there's not an equal playing field for everybody. Some folks have additional needs that others may not, and really pouring that into the mission and the work that you do moving forward. So that's relative to administration. We need folks leading agencies and organizations who have compassion and who have empathy and have a desire and will to do right by folks. So, last slide. Why this work matters? Because it does. It really does. I mean, because this is a population of young people who are least among us. I mean, you know, the sad reality is these young people come into, generally, as Karen said, 92% of young people who fit this definition's population, they start in child welfare. So when they come into child welfare, they are seen as victims. They have been victims of abuse or neglect. What happens when that system has not served them well, and they have those experiences that Karen talked about, they are more likely to then go into what? Another system. Why? Because the first system failed them. It didn't help them achieve safe. They weren't safe. They were not stabilized. They never achieved permanency. And so they had a lot of things happen. They are now in a second system where they are now viewed as perpetrators, but they started off as being victims. And so what happened to them as they continued in that was not through their own doing, but what happened to them. And so now we're shifting them into other adult carceral and custodial systems. And so that's why this work matters, because these are young people who continue to be victims, and the victimization continues into adulthood, but how we see them varies. Not because of anything else that they have done, but because they've aged. That's on us, that's not on them. So that's why this work matters, because that's what happens to this population. So we're going to just shift into taking questions, because I do realize we are past the time for questions to start. So I'm going to open up the floor. And you want to, and we did have a call to action. Yes, sir.
Great talk. Cool model. What are you guys learning about how it works? You know, what are you learning in terms of data? And do you feel like it's doing what you intended?
So I'll let Karen speak about the data piece. What I'll say is, from a practitioner perspective, it does work, but it's hard. It is hard because you're taking two monstrosities, the two systems, and you're telling them to merge. You're telling them to share resources, to share services, to share time, and the convergence of the two, it takes a long time for it to work. And it takes a leader and an administrator within those organizations to prioritize this work. When we sit down with communities, we literally are talking to them about, tell me what happens when a young person is arrested and they start going through your system. When the police pick them up and they go to the detention center, tell me what happens. And we've worked through all of that. Now, let's talk about how that can be different. How do you connect with the child welfare counterpart to see that they have an open case? What does that mean? What worker is going to be available to come to the detention center so they don't have to sit there for many hours? Or even in the reverse, if a young person is exiting a delinquency placement, when we know, even before we're preparing for discharge, how are we working with that family so they can go back home? If family says they can't, how are you partnering with your other agency and organization? I have a tag on my computer that says long suffering. I mean, generally, when we start working with the community, it takes no less than 18 to 24 months for us to go through the weeds of all of their case management and programmatic things to start making change. But the leaders have to be committed. And generally, even if they are committed, they have to be willing to give up the resources to sit and work with us to go through that process. And usually, them sticking to it and committing to it is because we have a judge who says everybody's going to show up and everybody's going to be there. In absence of that, we sometimes have folks who will do it, but whether it's prioritized or not, maybe not. And the other thing we've seen too is for all of the 120 plus communities, the practice doesn't look the same, number one, because it's tailored to that community. And sometimes after leadership changes have happened, the practice regresses and people go back to what they were doing before. So that's it. Yeah. And you can talk about the data piece, Karen.
I'm sure you could still talk about the data. So in terms of the data itself, the CYPM is listed under the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Model Programs Guide as showing promising evidence. And so that's showing that it's not just us doing evaluations, but also we rely on external evaluations of the model. And again, this is kind of in different jurisdictions. But what it's been shown is to reduce recidivism. For us, a lot of what we track when we look at youth outcomes is not just looking at did a youth commit another offense, but also like, was there the presence of pro-social behaviors, activities? Was the youth connected to a person that matters to them? So, showing positive results there. The other piece that, especially kind of given the current climate, I think is very appealing to a lot of folks is the potential for cost saving. So cost benefit analyses of CYPM, specifically in Nebraska, show that there is a cost savings because you're keeping youth from becoming deeper in the juvenile justice system. So they based it on less need for kind of specialized probation officers to deal with the population. And so kind of happy to talk more, but those are the main.
Oh, that's so cool. Can you do trials? Are you doing randomized trials of these things?
So,
I mean, it might be hard, but
doctors want RCTs and all that stuff. So it's out of Minnesota. University of Minnesota did do comparisons of a CYPM county and non-CYPM county. We get in a little, ethics and other pieces and like the how do we do it. So it's on our minds of how do we do it, but there just hasn't been large scale. And of course now funding and the lack of funding is always of concern. But yeah,
cool stuff.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's important to know that in this county, we've had CYPM for the past 10 years. We rolled it out 10 years ago because of Georgetown University, and the three of us worked for those two monstrosities.
Yes.
And I will say a couple of things. One is that in the beginning, it was, can we really do this? Because we are two monstrous agencies, but because there was a judge who spearheaded it, because both agencies got smart, were willing to spend the money to send people to Georgetown to learn the model, to bring it back. So we have a memorandum of understanding. Lisa and I both train incoming staff. Both CYF and JPO are hiring, so you all know. But it's very important to keep it going because we've had to break down so many barriers between the agencies and getting people to have relationships like the two of you mentioned, which is, where Macon works and you can call her and figure something out.
Yeah.
We do that here.
Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, there's a video that you all made that we still use, and that yes, we do. We still use it. We send it out to communities so they can see the possibility and what it requires. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
I just mentioned that as a juvenile probation officer, the biggest hurdle that we faced when we were working with our child welfare counterparts is getting our mission statements are different. And although we are working with that child, we always have to worry about the victim and make sure that that victim is being restored to whole as much as possible. And that gets lost a lot on the child welfare side because they're so hyper focused on the child. You know, we have to worry about the victims that were traumatized. And just like you mentioned, we have kids that have perped on kids, and now it's like a cycle.
Yes.
You know, so I just want people not to lose that fact that when a probation officer is doing their job, we can't worry about the kid first and foremost. We have to give just as much attention to that victim and then the community at large.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Leah Jacobs, faculty in the School of Social Work. Thanks so much for sharing your work in this model. I'm curious if most of your work around system change on the juvenile justice side of things has been more in corrections, or like how much you've done at the very front end with law enforcement. And then assuming that you have done some at the front end with law enforcement, could you tell me your tricks to get them to engage with you? Like, what motivates them to actually engage in systems change with you? And then connected to that, how do you hold on to your unequivocal position that, you know, the juvenile legal system is not a justice system while also engaging those members of the system?
So you asked several questions there. Let me start with the law enforcement question. So law enforcement is one of the entities that when we work with the community, we try to bring in. It does not always work. Generally, we try to leverage the judge, or in some communities, we have like council members, or like folks from like board of supervisors, people who help govern and control the money in a community. A lot of times they are able to get them there. But also we have to understand in a community, what does law enforcement look like? We may generally work in a county and not in a city. And in one county, you may have multiple law enforcement entities that feed into the court system there. So it's really figuring out, how do you get them there? Sometimes it's like we can get somebody from the sheriff's office, but we may not be able to get somebody from like the city police office. So we get whoever we can. That's a place where the judge comes in. But there have been some, and we have had some instances where law enforcement has said, you know, we don't go looking for kids. We just get the call. So we don't need to be here. We've had others who have been very, very meticulous, said, we get the calls, but we want to be able to do something different. We have no desire to lock kids up or to see them detained. We want to be able to have a more communal response. Usually, I would say the law enforcement entities that we're able to work with most are school resource officers. That has been a really good entry point for us. And whenever we have data within a community that shows the number of kids within the school setting that are being arrested, usually that is the driver for us being able to get SROs to the table. But we don't have, unfortunately, a magic pill for how to engage law enforcement. It is equally as tough to get educators to be a part of this work as it is law enforcement. But sometimes that's where we can use the judge and folks involved in the courts. But usually, like, they are elected officials, and they, in many communities, you know, they decide what tables they want to show up to or not. So it varies in every community. I will say that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sophie. I'm actually going to be a grad from the MSW program coming very soon. And thank you. And I have a very selfish question, so I hope I'm not taking anybody else's time. I love the presentation. I love both the work that you guys are doing. I'm actually looking to move and work in the DC area. And my selfish question is based off the areas that you guys mentioned at the end of your presentation of, you know, what we can do in working with this population. I don't want to mispronounce your name. Is it Macon? Megan, thank you. I'm so sorry about that.
No, you're fine.
You mentioned how you didn't foresee yourself starting child welfare, and I don't have any experience in starting with child welfare either, but also I will be looking for a job. Do you think anything has changed from when you were a recent graduate in terms of you were not regretful of starting in that because you think it helped you learn the system for your more research heavy position now? do you think times have changed in terms of you still think recent grads should get early access and early experience in something like that, which obviously might not be everybody's background like mine? Or do you see any of those other areas like administration or advocacy, especially during this kind of, I would say not election cycle, presidential cycle that we're in right now? Do you see those might be where maybe recent grads should turn their attention? That was a little bit of a heavy multi-pronged question, but selfish.
I mean, I think I say look where you feel like your interest lies.
Yeah.
And if there's something there, go for it. If there isn't, try something else. I mean, I'm the person who believes in just casting a wide net and then see what comes back. And like, you just never know what may be out there. That's what I would recommend. I mean, one thing I knew is, okay, I kind of may want to work with kids, but really it was like, we used to have a board on one of these floors that had job postings on the board. And so I went to the board and was like, okay, who's hired? And let me submit my application to those. And I knew I was okay with being in the DC area. I knew I no longer wanted to live in Pittsburgh. So that was kind of,
Me too.
but my internship at that time, I was at the VA here, and loved being at the VA. But there was I was here during 9/11. And so there was a hiring freeze within federal government. So that's why I could not stay here and work at the VA, because really I kind of thought that's what might happen. But it was like, okay, who's hiring? And it ended up being just an amazing opportunity for me. And so I said, just cast a wide net. But if there's something I don't want to do, then don't go for that. Like, I knew I did not want to do gerontology.
Say that to social students too.
So,
gerontology, that we need great gerontology people. That's not me.
Yeah. So if there's something you don't want to do, then don't go there. But anything else, cast a wide net. Because I always say there's something to be learned in everything. And so even if what you learn is, that's not for me, but there are some things that I can take away from that experience that will help inform where it is that I am going.
And I think to wrap it up too, with this value of a social work degree, that you can do so much. And I think that's where Macon and I really speak to it too. We both came into direct practice and now we are doing very non-direct practice things. And so, yeah, just being open to kind of all of the possibilities in social work and kind of taking out.
Thank you, you too.
Yep. Well, was there another? Oh, one more question.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Megan. Thank you both so much for your presentation and the work that you're doing. I'm not sure if you will have an answer to my question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, just for your thoughts and reflections, as it's related to the work that you do, but a little bit ad hoc, I guess. But my dissertation research and my personal research that I do is focused on how post-secondary institutions can support students who are enrolled, particularly who have lived experience of the child welfare system. And as you, I'm sure, both know, right, the outcomes of that population ever graduating with a post-secondary degree are dire, but we all, I think, know collectively how important it is. And so I've been thinking a lot about the crossover population actually as a population that I think is even more invisible than just, I think, students who have lived experience in the child welfare system. And so I'm just curious for your reflections of how you feel institutions can better support this population, particularly thinking about some of the pieces that you talked about as it relates to the crossover population.
Okay, I will. So, I mean, I would say number one, young people knowing that this is an option. I mean, because this population of young people probably don't see themselves as being able to go to an institution at all. I mean, they are struggling with surviving and not thriving. So I think it starts there. And once they are in these spaces, providing just those real tangible supports that young people need, like where are they going to go during break? Helping them to ensure that they have housing, that they have food, that they are afforded all of the comforts that any other student any other normal student for the most part that are within educational settings have, so that they can then just focus on the education part of it. But then also understanding that there have likely been breaks within their educational experience. And so identifying what are those academic supports that can be provided to them along the way so that they can succeed, or, you know, them being comfortable knowing, okay, I can go to office hours, I can have a tutor, I can get special accommodations and different things like that. And if it takes me a little bit longer to finish because I'm making up for what I didn't have before I got here, like that's okay.
And I was just gonna add the role of support. So somebody that's caring individual, I think a lot of times when we talk with young people, kind of what made the difference, and they'll talk about one person that really was invested in them or cared. So I'm sure, like, kind of, as you know, the other piece is the socialization into this environment, kind of to what Macon's point was with, you know, kind of just navigating breaks, things like that. And I was gonna add one more thing. Oh, strengths. That's what we talk about this, and it's so dire and it's so whatever, but young people have been through so much, and I hate saying the resiliency narrative, but at the same time, I think talking with young people who've been through this, they're not always able to see past the traumas or to see all the good things that they are bringing to the table and really see that as valuable. And especially in this environment, more and more, I do think lived experience is more valued. So they don't sometimes even know that. So, you know, helping navigate, you know, kind of what are the positives that they're bringing to the table, because they really are bringing a lot of experiences that for folks who don't have that aren't going to kind of be able to learn from.
Can I touch on that? That's kind of what I do. I'm a education enrichment liaison, and I work with foster youth, 14 to 24. And that's what I do, help them go through the process from high school to college. And we stay with them and follow them. So it's possible. Like, I'm always at the colleges. Hey, do you know about the foster care tuition waiver? Do you know about, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just to make sure they have a connection there. Because once they age out of my services, then, you know, so yeah, there's in Allegheny County, we have people set for that.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, I want to be respectful of everybody's time. And I want to thank Karen and Macon for everything that they brought to us today. I also want to remind several of the things that were said today. I have to say I'm having PTSD here because when I entered the field in 1984, we were having these exact same conversations. The Child and Adolescent Service System program, for those of you who've been around for a while, we spent a whole lot of time with demonstration projects in every state in the country, in the country, to try to build these systems of care, to try to get systems to talk to each other, to try to figure out how do we serve kids across systems better. And I think we thought we were making some changes. I mean, we said there had been a paradigm shift, that nobody would ever go back to these silos, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to remind us all, for those of you who are new to the field, please go back and look at the history. CASP, the book Unclaimed Children in 1982 was a groundbreaking piece that made us think about these issues and made us do a whole lot of stuff. But we have to continue this work, that each generation, as systems develop, they're not going to just maintain this stuff magically. It depends on us continuing to do things and to continuing to push forward. So I want to thank both of you for all you're doing, and for all of you who are in the field, entering the field, doing what you do. It's the only way that we're going to keep things moving forward and actually serve kids and families in systems that make sense. So thank you so much for bringing this to us. We could talk all afternoon, but I know you have some other students you're supposed to be meeting with. So let's give a thanks, please, to Macon and Karen. And for all of you who are sitting here and thinking, oh, I'd like to learn more about things, in a week and a half, on Monday, the 24th, we're having another symposium all day here, the Human Flourishing Symposium, which is going to be touching in more kind of general ways on a lot of the topics that were brought up today. So those of you who have interest in it, please sign up for that and come to that. And, you know, continue doing everything that we do. So thanks so much for coming.
Oh, thank you. Hey, how are ya? Hi. Is it? Okay, okay. Yeah.